I'm Danny Kashubi with the Institute for Bird Populations and with the Western Bird Banding Association. I'd like to introduce Ryan Terrill, and his research has focused on characterizing evolution through feather replacement in birds, molt, as well as the ecology of birds in the New World tropics. He earned his PhD from Louisiana State University and was a postdoctoral NSF fellow and has published dozens of peer-reviewed articles and is the co-author of The Bolivian Bird Field Guide, if you've got that one. He's involved in discovering and describing a new species and genus of bird science, the Inti tanager, can't speak English, in Bolivia. And he's served on various committees and boards, including the editorial boards of the Western Birds and the Neotropical Naturalist Journals, the California Birds Records Committee, and the Howard and Moore Checklist of the Birds of the World Advisory Committee. In 2023, he joined Klamath Bird Observatory as their science director, where he advances science focused on bird populations and their response to management and restoration, and contributes to forest collaboratives and provides expertise specific to bird conservation and the application of birds as focal species to inform planning and evaluate success. And without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Ryan, and we'll save your questions or put them in the chat, and we'll answer all of those this evening. So Ryan, it's all yours.
Cool. Thank you so much. Let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. How's that looking, Danny?
Looks great.
Cool. Hey, thanks everybody for having me. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate that introduction a lot. A quick note on background here. I'm really excited to be getting involved with the Western Bird Banding Association. You know, bird banding is where my interest in ornithology and a lot of this work started. Back when I was in high school, I started banding birds at the Big Sur Ornithology Lab. And that was what really got me interested in pursuing a career in ornithology and biology, and interested in starting to ask some of these questions that I'm talking about today, specifically, as probably everybody here knows, you know, when we're banding birds, we're interested in looking at molt patterns for aging birds, also sometimes for identification, sometimes even for sexing birds. You know, and we have this great book right here that tells us what we're looking for in different species, you know, and when I was banding these birds, you know, I started to become curious about, you know, well, why do we need this book? Why don't all birds just molt the same way? You know, why don't we just look for the same things in all birds? And as I started to think about this question more and research it, I realized that, you know, there hasn't been much research into the whys of molt. There's been a lot of work on the whats and the hows, and there's been a lot of descriptive work, including, you know, by Pyle, and Steve Howell and others, about what birds do and what kind of molt strategies birds do. But the whys, specifically, why do, you know, different birds have different molt strategies? What can that tell us about birds' lives and birds' evolution were questions that really piqued my interest, and that I realized that there hadn't been quite as much research into. And that was sort of what set me down the trajectory that I'm still on today. And so I'm really happy to be sort of coming back into the world of bird banding, which is where I started getting interested in these questions. And again, being able to talk with people who are interested in bird molt, a lot of people who are as interested in bird molt as I am, and think about some of these questions. So I really appreciate you all having me, and it's really special to me to be here. So I'll go ahead and start. I've got a little bit of introductory stuff, kind of about my research and how these questions fit in my perspective into deeper questions in biology in general and motivations, and then I'll kind of get into the paper here. So in general, I would say that I study where birds live and how birds live. And the main questions I try to address here is what forces shape and change avian distributions, which I'll talk a little bit about today. And then what we'll get more into today is what can feather replacement tell us about birds' lives, and what can feather replacement tell us about a bird's evolution? And of course, the more we know about birds' lives and birds' distributions, we can better conserve birds and other biota that, you know, either interact with birds in an ecological sense or live in the same places as birds. We can also learn about how ecology, interaction, evolution, and biogeography interact. And the big takeaway here, oh, this was for, sorry, this slide I stuck in when I was giving this talk in a biogeography class, but it's an important point that how animals live determines where animals can live. And evolutionary history determines both. So we can think of ecology, evolution, and biogeography as one kind of interlinked process. So as far as the questions of molt, what we might want to think about is where do birds live and how do birds live? And how does that affect how and when they need to replace their feathers? So in this research, in my research topics here, I'll mainly be talking about this first part, the feather replacement and avian evolution. So if we think about this idea about how do birds replace their feathers and try to get deeper into the whys, why birds replace their feathers the way they do, we can think about what are the mechanisms and drivers of evolution of molt strategies, and what might be the implications for life history and evolution of birds having different molt strategies. When we think about distributions, like where birds live, well, there might be influences of ecology and life history. And of course, distributions might make birds differentially susceptible to human influence. These seem like different topics, but they're really closely intertwined, right? The influences of ecology and life history have direct implications for mechanisms of evolution, and implications for life history and ecology have direct implications for bird distributions. So I gather data for these questions with field study. Oh, I think Maeve's on the call. You can see her ponytail on that picture on the left. Museum study, bird banding. I won't be talking much about genetics today. We'll be mainly in the realm today on the left here of phylogenetic comparative analyses, which is really just the methods of comparing different species using our knowledge about their evolutionary history. So feather replacement in avian evolution here, or molt. I think molt is an understudied subject, as far as I know, especially with regards to the whys, the mechanisms, and the relationships to ecology and evolution. And I think molt has a lot to tell us about bird evolution and ecology. And so, my goals in studying molt are not just to learn about molt, which I'm very interested in learning about molt, learning about why birds molt the way they do and how birds molt the way they do. But I think there's also an important other aspect here, which is what can learning about bird molt tell us about birds, tell us about other aspects of birds' evolution and ecology, natural history, biogeography, conservation, etc. So if we want to think about why birds molt the way they do, I think the first step is to think about what feathers do for birds. So here's this bird that's on Instagram called Rhea, the naked birdie. It has a disorder that it doesn't grow any feathers. And where does this bird live? Well, lives in a house, has little hoodies, being cared for. When birds are really small nestlings, most birds, hatch out of the egg with little to no feathering, and they are incredibly vulnerable, right? They have to be actively taken care of. This bird could not live in the wild for very long. It would freeze to death. It wouldn't be able to fly away from predators. It wouldn't be able to fly to get food. There would be all sorts of problems with it. So if this bird has no feathers, like it's toast, right? Pretty quick, unless it worked out a sweet gig like this one did. But with feathers, this bird lives in wooded grasslands, mainly in Tanzania. And so the feathers that a bird has allow it to occupy whatever geographic area or ecological niche it's in by protecting it from heat, protecting it from cold, keeping it waterproof, whatever signaling functions it has. The feathers that a bird has are really integral to every aspect of its life and are the product of a long and complicated evolutionary history of interactions between this bird's environment, its lifestyle, and its genome, right? And so feathers are really integral to every part of a bird's life. They can serve things like waterproofing. They can help birds with foraging. They can serve for camouflage for predators, physical protection for the bird and for each other. One really important function of feathers is just protecting each other, coverts, right? They can serve for flight, balance, thermoregulation, signaling. And so a really important thing to keep in mind here is that feathers are incredibly multifunctional. They do lots and lots of different things. And some of the things they do better than really any other known biological structure. Feathers are, I think, the best thermoregulatory biological structure known. That's why we have down jackets and down comforters and stuff. And feathers, birds fly better than any other flying organism. Lots of organisms can fly, but what other organisms can migrate from the Arctic to Antarctica and back every year for 20 years? Not dragonflies. Love dragonflies. No, no shade on dragonflies. Just saying. Feathers are what make birds so good at what they do. And feathers have the multifunctionality of feathers is what has contributed to birds being so diverse because they can use the same structure to do really different stuff. But feathers are really lightweight and they begin to degrade as soon as they're grown. And they generally don't last more than a year or so. So this painted bunting is doing pre-basic molt. You can see it's got these nice new blue, red, and green feathers growing in. And these old feathers that are just about a year old are really worn and they're just about to outlive their usefulness. If this bird kept all these feathers around for too much longer, it would have a hard time staying warm and dry. It would certainly have a very hard time finding a mate and conducting other functions. And so the big question here is why do different species of birds replace their feathers in different ways? Why do we need to have a big book that tells us about the different ways that different birds replace their feathers? Why can't we just have a one page that's like, this is how birds replace their feathers? We could have that with human hair. We don't need a book to tell us how every certain person's hair grows. It's like, the hair just kind of grows. Maybe that's not true. Maybe different people's hair grows in different ways. I actually don't know, but just using that as an example, mammal hair, just sort of grows, I guess. I don't know. Never mind. But the answer might lie in the fact that feather functions vary among species across both space and time. So different birds use their feathers to do different things. And individual birds can use their feathers to do different things depending on the time of year. They might be using their feathers for sexual signaling during the breeding season, trying to find a mate, trying to keep competitors away, where that signaling function may be more geared towards avoiding predators during a different time of year. There may be some birds that are a lot more reliant on flight than other birds. There are plenty of flightless birds that don't fly at all. So feather functions vary among different species of birds and even within species of birds and even within individual birds during different times. And so we can sort of ask this question that might shed some light on why birds replace their feathers in different ways, which is how should these feathers be replaced to optimize fitness? Assuming or with the thought in mind that all these functions of the feathers contribute to the bird's fitness in some way. And so we might want to think about where the bird lives, what its feathers do, and how it lives. And another way to say that is distributions, physical traits, and life history. And so this sort of comes back to my point that I think understanding molt can tell us a lot about birds because feathers are really tightly linked to how and where birds live. And this big idea of what the interactions are between distributions, physical traits, and life history really opens up a lot of the fundamental questions of ecology and evolution in general, right? And so I just want to talk about one project that I worked on a few years ago in graduate school with Jared Wolf, who's now at Michigan Tech. He's a good friend of mine and a fantastic collaborator and probably somebody I imagine most people here are familiar with. He's published a whole lot on molt. And Glenn Seeholzer, who is now the curator of the Macaulay Library. So if you put any pictures or video or audio of birds into eBird, he is now the puppet master of all of that media. So the question here that we wanted to get at is how do molt strategies evolve? And we looked specifically here at pre-alternate molt. I designed these slides for a pretty broad audience. I designed these slides to be able to give these talks to students in biology classes, especially, but also, people attending conferences. And so this is going to explain molt on a much more basic level than I'm sure a lot of you understand. So bear with me because I know that some of my explanation is going to seem very obvious to you. And I try to avoid technical terminology, which I normally wouldn't if I made this presentation from the ground up for bird banders. So that being said, some birds have different breeding and non-breeding plumages. Well, going back, no, there we go. Some birds have different breeding and non-breeding plumages. Not all birds have different breeding and non-breeding plumages. So one example is this chestnut-sided warbler. It looks different in the summer than it does in the winter, right? And these birds, a lot of these birds that look different in the summer and the winter, not all of them, they replace feathers twice a year. So they look different because they have different feathers between the summer and the winter. There are some birds that look different because of feather wear, but that's outside of warblers. We're not talking about that right now, although that's cool. But there are plenty of other birds that keep the same plumage all year, like black-throated blue warbler. They don't have a pre-alternate molt. They just have one pre-basic molt, and they keep those feathers all year. And so our question here is why? Why do some birds replace their feathers twice a year and have breeding and non-breeding plumages, while some birds don't do that? They only replace their feathers once a year and they keep those feathers all year. And an important thing to understand here is that the first annual molt, which we call the pre-basic molt, involves all the feathers, pretty much. And the second annual molt, which we call the pre-alternate molt, involves only some feathers. And another thing to keep in mind is the functions of molt. Molt can serve two pretty different functions. One is just structural replacement. So on the top here, this banded storm petrel, its outer primaries are really worn. They're not that good at flying anymore. And it is replacing them with these inner primaries, which are nice and new, and they're going to do their job pretty well. So it's just really replacing worn feathers so that they can do their job. But the second function of molt is often phenotype alteration. So that is a new feather can grow in and replace an old feather. That new feather can have a different color, a different shape, a different pattern than the old feather. So there's two really different functions of molt: structural replacement, just replacing broken down feathers, or phenotype alteration, which is completely changing something about the morphology of the feather. So our question here was to try to drill down on this. Which of these two functions drives the evolution of the second annual molt? Does that make sense? Well, even if it doesn't, nobody would be able to tell me no, so never mind. You can tell me after if that doesn't make sense. Is that second molt mainly evolving due to some sort of need for structural replacement or some sort of need for phenotype alteration? And so we can break these into two different hypotheses. One, which the top one, is related to phenotype alteration. We call that the color change hypothesis. And this would be, I would say, sort of the conventional wisdom about breeding and non-breeding plumages, which is that there are different relative levels of selection from signaling for conspecifics during the summer and avoiding predators during the winter, where there might be stronger selection to have a bright and showy plumage, for example, for a male chestnut-sided warbler to be able to attract females and to be able to defend territory against other males, whereas not in the summer, when they're not on their breeding territory, that strength of selection for bright plumage might be less, such that the selection provided on plumage color to avoid predators is stronger. So birds are evolving the second molt so that they can have their cake and eat it too. They can be bright and showy and flashy in the summer, but then they can hide from predators in the winter when they don't need that bright, flashy, showy. So we call that the color change hypothesis. Birds evolve pre-alternate molt in order to change their colors. The second hypothesis, which is contingent on what we call structural replacement, is the feather wear hypothesis. Maybe birds molt their feathers twice a year. Birds that molt their feathers twice a year. For some reason, their feathers are just wearing more quickly. So they just need to replace their feathers more often because for some sort of structural reason, either their feathers are wearing more quickly, or for some reason the feathers are not performing the function that they need to be performing. So our approach here was a phylogenetic comparative analysis. So what we did was we took a lot of aspects of molt, here presence of pre-alternate molt by body region, and placed them on a phylogeny. So there's a few interesting things to note here. So here we have a phylogeny that's colored by presence of pre-alternate molt. The more red it is, the more extensive pre-alternate molt is in that species. The more blue it is, the less extensive pre-alternate molt is in that species, or they have no pre-alternate molt. This is a subset of the phylogeny, but there's a few things to notice here. So pre-alternate molt isn't just in one place in the phylogeny, so it didn't just evolve once, which is good to know because it's hard to tell stories about things that only evolved once, because there was maybe some pressure in the past and something responded to it and evolved something new. And it's like, who knows what was going on 12 million years ago in these warblers. So it's evolved repeatedly. So that means there's probably some sort of theme to the selective pressures that have given rise to pre-alternate molt. And there's a pattern in where on the bird's body the pre-alternate molt is. So all the way on the left is the head, all the way on the right are the secondaries. So this is ordered from where pre-alternate molt is more common to where it's less common. And that bird in the upper left there is colored by how common pre-alternate molt tends to be among warblers. So every single warbler that has a pre-alternate molt, if it has a pre-alternate molt, it has pre-alternate molt of the head. Almost all of them that have pre-alternate molt, they have pre-alternate molt on the breast, and then the belly, then the back, then the median coverts, the greater coverts, tertials. And in warblers, at least, none of them include primaries or secondaries or rectrices in pre-alternate molt. There are some other birds that do, but we're just talking about warblers today. And of course, as you know, that cartoon has the wing out a little bit, so you can see the primaries and secondaries. But most birds, when their wing is folded from straight above, you can't really see those primaries or secondaries at all. They're completely covered by the coverts and the tertials, and that's something that's kind of important that I'll get back to. I just want to point out patterns right now. So what we did was we used evolutionary models to try to understand how molt color and life history are related over time. So we looked at all sorts of aspects of birds' lives and biology. So not just the extent of pre-alternate molt, the extent of seasonal dichromatism, which is how different birds look between the summer and the winter, and sexual dichromatism, which is how different males and females looked. Body mass, things like breeding elevation, breeding range, temperature, migratory distance, solar radiation. We even looked at a bunch more than this, but like nest type, nest stratum, foraging stratum, all sorts of stuff that like may or may not affect feathers, right? What feathers are needed for and how they wear. We built these evolutionary models to try to understand like which of these aspects are connected to each other and which of these aspects are connected to molt. And we use these models to then propose path hypotheses. And path analysis is kind of it's a way to understand not only directionality, but complicated relationships between variables. You've all heard, correlation doesn't equal causation because you just have one thing and you have another thing and they're, similar in some way. Well, path analysis helps you shed a little bit of light on directionality. So this thing influences this thing. And you could say this and this influences this, or this influences this, which influences that. You find some sort of path between the variables. And so these are just hypotheses that we propose. So what we do with path analysis, you propose hypotheses, you throw data at the hypotheses, and then it tells you which of your hypothesis is the best. It ranks them just like any other model selection. I'll come back to that. The reason we did this is we think that the evolutionary drivers of molt may be more complicated than just, here's one thing, this is why molt happens. It probably has to do with all sorts of aspects of birds' lives and biology. Again, because feathers do so many things for birds, and feathers do different things for different birds. So looking at this first hypothesis, the color change hypothesis, we found, a slight positive but not significant relationship between seasonal color change and extent of pre-alternate molt. Here I called it extent of the second molt, again, because I didn't want, don't necessarily want people to have to memorize jargon when I'm giving this talk, but you all know, hopefully, I think you all know what I'm talking about, the second molt, I'm talking about the pre-alternate molt. So there were plenty of birds that had a pre-alternate molt that was more extensive than the colors that changed between the summer and breeding season. So, for example, water thrushes have a pre-alternate molt in the head, but the feathers look exactly the same. And most birds that we think of that have different plumages in the summer and winter, like Canada warbler or chestnut-sided warbler, their pre-alternate molt is more extensive than the color change. So that at least some of the feathers they grow in the same color and the same pattern in pre-alternate and pre-basic. We did, however, find a positive and significant relationship between migration distance and extent of pre-alternate molt. So birds that migrate farther tend to have a more extensive pre-alternate molt than residents or short distance migrants. And just to cover really quickly the evolution of migration, because it's a really complicated thing. It's really tempting to think that birds that are migrants, evolve migration, once when at the end of the Ice Age or something like that. But we're really, when you think about geologic history, we're still in the Pleistocene, which was composed of, this is only the last 6.5 million years, but going back to the last about 10 or 15 million years, there were, I think, 23 of these glacial and interglacial cycles. We happen to be in an interglacial cycle right now, where glaciers, from a North American perspective, covered a lot of the continent in the glacial periods and were free. A lot of the continent was free of glaciers in the interglacial periods, like now. And even, past interglacials have been warmer than this interglacial. And so this habitable area where birds can live changes between these cycles. And these birds have sort of colonized these areas and evolved migration and lost migration probably over and over and over again. And the idea behind the evolution of migration is simply that birds probably migrate as a form of hibernation. So they migrate when they breed in an area that can't survive the winter. So even in interglacials, the winter is pretty similar to what the summer was like in glacial periods. And so really the important part of the story I'm trying to tell here is that the evolution of migration in warblers, and probably most birds, is really complex, where migration has probably been gained and lost over and over. And in fact, as far as we can tell, at least in warblers, a lot of the resident warblers have probably lost migration. So instead of migration necessarily being evolved in migrant birds from resident birds, at least as far as we can tell, ancestral warblers probably had some sort of short distance migration. So that's orange here. So what I'm showing you now is migration length, where more red is are species that migrate farther, and more yellow is resident species. If you look back there at the base of the tree, it's orange, So those birds may have been migrants, and you see a number of times a shift from orange to yellow, which is birds losing migration, which has been found. These aren't novel results. This has been found by a few other researchers in warblers, even, that resident warblers have probably lost migration. And there have been multiple gains and losses of migration. And warblers have also gained and lost this pre-alternate molt multiple times. You look back at the base of the tree, it's pretty orange, just like the last tree. Another thing to note is that solar radiation is really the primary cause of feather degradation. If you've ever worked in a natural history museum, you know that the main thing to keep specimens looking nice is just to keep them out of the sun. Any bacteria that are on the feathers, any mites that are on the feathers, may be dealt with a little bit by naphthalene, but collections managers don't really worry too much about things like feather bacteria and feather mites. It's really ultraviolet radiation. If you've ever seen a specimen in a display case that's near an open window, it probably looks terrible if it's been there more than a couple months, right? But you can go to the Smithsonian and you can find specimens that were collected over 200 years ago, and they look perfect if they're kept out of ultraviolet light. And so exposure to the sunlight is probably the primary cause of feather degradation in most birds. Which brings us to one of the more striking results we found, although I think it's pretty intuitive, is that warblers that migrate farther, they experience longer days throughout the year than resident birds. So for example, a blackpoll warbler, which is our bird that migrates the farthest and experiences the longest days, it spends its winter in the tropics, where it gets about 12 hours of sunlight, and the summer way up in, northern Alaska, some of them, where it gets like 22 hours of sunlight. That gets more sunlight out of the year than a resident bird that's farther north and has those long summers but short winters, or a resident bird that just has 12 hours of light all year. And so when we looked at the amount of daylight that migrant birds are exposed to, the blackpoll warbler was exposed to something like 6 weeks more of daylight than resident tropical warblers. So really strong relationship there between how far bird flies and how much daylight it's exposed to, which again, the daylight is what, as far as we know, is making feathers wear and need to be replaced. When we looked at transitions, evolutionary transitions from a basic strategy, which is no pre-alternate molt, to an alternate strategy, which has a pre-alternate molt, what we found is that this transition is greatly favored in lineages that have long distance migrations. So these arrows are evolutionary transitions. So if you look at the real big arrow right there, which is the main transitions from no second molt, no pre-alternate molt again, to a pre-alternate molt, It basically always happens when a long distance migration is already present in this lineage. If you go all the way over to, does pre-alternate molt evolve in birds that don't migrate? That's a zero, right? We found we found zero transition rate of evolution of pre-alternate molt in non-migrants. And when you look at the feather regions, I promised I'd come back to this, that are replaced in pre-alternate molt, they're regions that are more exposed to the sun. You know, they're the head, the breast, the back, the coverts, and the feathers that are mostly covered up, like the remiges and you know, the belly, are not that often replaced. And when we look at our most likely path analysis, our most likely path hypothesis here, what we find is that this pre-alternate molt is primarily driven by day length experienced by birds, which is then in turn driven by migration distance. So hopefully now you see what I mean about, you know, the multi-step relationships that we can get at with path analysis. And then what's driven by the pre-alternate molt is seasonal dichromatism. So once birds have seasonal pre-alternate molt, then they can evolve what we call seasonal dichromatism, which is looking different between the summer and the winter, which is partly driven by foraging stratum. So in general, birds that forage up in the canopy, they tend to, when they have a pre-alternate molt, look more different between the summer and the winter than birds that forage in the understory. So for example, water thrushes and ovenbirds have a pre-alternate molt but tend to look really similar, whereas bay-breasted warblers who are up in the canopy have a pre-alternate molt and tend to look more different. So coming back to these hypotheses, the color change hypothesis. Did we find any evidence that pre-alternate molt evolved in response to variable relative levels of selection from mates? And I should just say conspecific, because it's not just mates, it's also competitors versus predators throughout the year. We actually didn't really find any evidence to support this. What we did find is a slightly more complex pathway that supports the feather wear hypothesis, where birds that evolve long distance migration end up being exposed to more sunlight, which degrades their feathers more quickly, and they evolve this second annual molt, the pre-alternate molt, simply to replace worn feathers. Of course, birds that do pre-alternate molt do look different, at least some of them, when they do pre-alternate molt. And we're not saying that there are no differences in relative levels of selection and that these relative levels of selection have no bearing on the evolution of the phenotype of the birds. It's just we found that those differences don't seem to drive the evolution of the molt. Instead, what it is this molt seems to evolve in response to worn feathers and then provide a platform for birds to be able to change their colors. So once birds have that second molt, then that second molt allows them to respond to that differential selective pressures. But the differential selective pressures don't seem to be strong enough on their own to initiate the evolution of a pre-alternate molt. And that explains the apparent paradox of birds like northern water thrush that molt their feathers twice a year, but they look the exact same throughout the year, right? Why do it? Why go through the trouble of mulching your head feathers twice if you're gonna look exactly the same? You know why? It's like if you go to a ballet and the lead ballerina goes back for a clothes change and then comes back in the exact same clothes, like why'd you go through all that effort, you know? So it was a paradox, but I think this kind of helps explain that paradox. And another thing that sort of supports this is, like I said, a lot of warblers have lost migration. In fact, as far as we know, most, if not all, of the resident tropical warblers have lost migration in their evolutionary history, and none of them do a pre-alternate molt. And so what we find is this pathway is reversible too. So you might have a long distance migrant bird that molts twice a year. It has this nice ornamented breeding plumage and a more cryptic winter plumage. When they lose migration, they lose that second molt. And then they're sort of forced to choose between, either you're going to be ornamented all year like a red warbler, or you're going to be cryptic all warbler like a Santa Marta warbler. And that also provides, I think, evidence to support this hypothesis, because we don't really expect necessarily the selective differences between predators and conspecifics to change all that much when a bird loses migration. They might to some extent, but not as much as daylight. And so what we found here is that featherwear associated, we found support for the idea that featherwear associated with long distance migration appears to be the primary driving force behind the evolution of biannual molt in warblers. I don't think this is necessarily the case for all birds. I think things like, ptarmigans that are white in the snowy winter and they're brown in the rocky summer. And in fact, they even have a third plumage where they're mottled in the fall. That is probably pretty strongly driven by phenotype change. But at least in warblers, and I think probably in a number of other groups, namely shorebirds, gulls, terns, beard, a lot of the passerines, this may be the case that featherwear associated with long distance migration is probably the primary driving force behind the evolution of pre-alternate. And that's all I have on that topic. So thanks everybody, and I'm more than happy to take questions in English or in Espanol. I can try my best in Portuguese, and that's about it. So thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. Appreciate it. That was fascinating.
And I'll leave my slides up so that I can go back to slides for individual questions if that works. Sorry to interrupt.
Nope, that's okay. I was just going to say, so if anyone has a question, just unmute yourself or put it in the chat, and we'll go from there. But I think Blake is ready to go, and we'll go with him first. Nope, he's not ready to go. Okay. So if anyone does have a question, just unmute, and then I'll be able to see you and I can call on you. But I do have a question. So in your paper, Ryan, did you just look at warblers, or did you look at like sparrows and finches and things? And like when I think about this, I always talk about this distance thing, but then I always have that goldfinch, the American goldfinch, that just doesn't fit the pattern. They don't go anywhere, but they molt like, two different looks in the winter and the summer. Or did you look at those, or just the warblers?
We only looked at warblers, and I think the story clearly would get a lot more interesting if we looked more broadly. The cool thing about warblers is they're fairly diverse, not only in number of species, but in life history and extent of molt and extent of plumage variation. And so it was a good group to dig into the evolution of this stuff. And there's a good recent phylogeny. I think there's all sorts of cool opportunities to expand this into things like finches. I think shorebirds would be a great one because they have variation in breeding strategy. Warblers generally have similar breeding strategies, whereas shorebirds have like polyandry and polygyny and all sorts of stuff going on, which really gives you cool variation in sexual selection, which warblers don't quite have as much. So this was just warblers, but I think there are cool, you would get different or slightly to largely different answers in different groups. I think there's an extent to which this helps explain pre-alternate molts in other groups, and it helps us understand the evolutionary history of molts in other groups, but I don't think that the story would be exactly the same in other groups.
Cool. Okay, so we do have a question. I think it was Alessandro. Alex, do you want to go for it?
Hey, yeah, that was a great talk. The slides were really aesthetically pleasing. But you mentioned the birds that don't have an obvious difference in their pre-alternate molts, like thrushes is one example. There's some warblers. I wonder how sure we are of that. Do you know? Because I think there's some studies coming out that suggest if you look at different color spectrums, there might be some subtle differences here. So do you know, can you speak about that in a general sense or with a specific species if you know?
That is a fantastic point for a number of reasons. Yeah, I didn't mean to oversell the idea, and I kind of did, so I appreciate you reeling it in, that birds that have pre-alternate molt can sometimes look the same between basic and alternate. I think this idea helps explain what seems to be a paradox there, but just because the feathers look the same to us does not mean the feathers look the same to them. Not only are there differences in ultraviolet reflectance. Hi, hold on, somebody. Oh, hello, sorry. Not only might there be differences in ultraviolet that we can't see, but there is even some evidence to suggest that birds can assess feather condition when choosing mates. There's a study in terns from a number of years ago. I forget the exact study. I think it was Eli Bridge that found that female terns were able to distinguish between, when looking at males, which ones had more extensive partial molts, even though, as far as we could tell, the morphology was pretty similar. To our eye, when we're looking at birds. Let me close my door real quick, just a second. Pardon me, sorry.
It's okay. We all live in houses.
Oh, I'm in my office. It's the cleaning crew.
Oh, okay.
To our eye, when we can tell a fresh feather from an old feather, by looking at differences in wear and coloration and stuff like that. And there's no reason to think that birds can't either. It's a very good point, and I think there's a lot more to look at there. I mean, shoot, maybe maybe birds are replacing their feathers twice a year just to be able to show off that they can replace their feathers more often. That's certainly like a really interesting idea to look into, and there has to be some extent to which that is the case, I imagine.
Cool. All right, and David Tan, you have a question? Go for it.
Hi, Ryan. Great talk. Thanks. Really interested in hearing about this. I'm not super familiar with North American birds because I'm not from North America, but you mentioned very offhand that lice are not going to be a major effector of molt patterns. But did you actually look at louse loads on the per species level, or do you expect that in species or in taxa with higher louse loads, say columbids, you would see lice becoming a more dominant driver of molt patterns as well?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that's also an avenue that needs more research. There has been, again, off the top of my head, I'd have to find the citations, but there has been a little bit of research into that, finding that birds with higher louse loads don't seem to show too much more feather wear. It seems like the amount of keratin ingested by lice is not like super significant compared to the amount of wear that happens from ultraviolet light. But so no, I didn't look at that. I think it would be a really cool and important thing to look at. I think understanding exactly the extent to which different factors contribute to feather wear is really important. And maybe maybe you're both finding things that I think I oversold a little bit for the sake of the story, because I think that is still, if not an open question, a very interesting question, to what extent feather wear is contributed to by different factors, including lice and things like keratin-eating bacteria. I think birds that have heavy louse loads, like pigeons, and I don't think warblers have super extensive louse loads. In fact, compared to things like pigeons or, even larger birds that may have endemic species of lice. Yeah, I didn't mean to make that sound like it was an answered question or not an interesting thing to think about, because I think it very much is, and certainly could have some sort of effect on the evolution of molts in other taxa, maybe even warblers, but it would probably be more pronounced and more easy to find in other taxa like Pittis, maybe. So thank you.
Okay, we have a question here from Alessandra. What about individuals that suspend their pre-alternate molt? What would be the mechanisms involved, and are there any potential advantages to this?
That's a great question. To my knowledge, we don't understand the physiological mechanisms of molt suspension. I don't think we even understand the physiological mechanisms of molt timing to the extent that there is variation in molt timing between species. So we have some idea of the hormonal cascades that set off molt, after breeding. Especially there are hormonal cascades, especially testosterone drops, that triggers a surge in prolactin, which triggers molt. But some birds molt right after breeding, or even overlapping with breeding a bit, and some birds wait. And what exactly causes that pause to happen, we don't understand. And is that the same mechanism that causes molt suspension? We don't know. Also, what is the evolutionary history and what are the evolutionary drivers of molt suspension? We don't know. I think we have some ideas. For example, there might be evolutionary advantages to, especially in migratory birds, to showing up on breeding range with daisy fresh feathers, or showing up on a wintering range with, nice daisy fresh feathers. There might even be advantages to beginning a molt as early as you can and suspending it over migration, and then finishing it when you get to your wintering grounds instead of waiting till you get to your wintering grounds till we start. So I think the suspension of molt, understanding the causes and mechanisms of molt suspension, I think is one of the really fascinating areas that should be looked into, that I think will give us a lot of insight into all of these subjects.
Great. I don't have any other questions that have rolled in. Is there anyone else with a question? While we're waiting for potential questions, thank you, Ryan, for your time tonight. It was great. That lets me have some nerd out moments. I love it. And this talk, there is another question, but I'm going to put a spiel in. This is presented by the Western Bird Banding Association, and we do have some more talks coming up through the spring. We're going to take a break through the summer when everyone is really busy, but I'll send out emails with the links to register for the next talk, so hopefully you can join us for those. And if you wish to become a member of the Western Bird Banding Association, we love to have new members, and our email address is westernbirdbanding.org. And so we invite new members. But I do have another question. I just want to make sure I didn't miss one. But here's another one. As a small follow-up, is there any correlation with species that have suspended pre-alternate molts and migration distance?
That's a great question. I don't know. I would love for somebody to come back to me with an answer on that, because there certainly might be, and I could envision a lot of reasons that might be the case. I think there's probably almost certainly a relationship between presence of migration and molt suspension. I imagine that birds that migrate are more likely to suspend molts, but whether that's true and whether birds that migrate farther are more likely to suspend molts versus birds that migrate short and more migrate less distance, I guess I'm trying to say, sorry, are also open and fascinating questions.
Just as a side to that one, I don't know of species that suspend during pre-alternate. Do you know off the top of your head any species, just so I can put it in my brain?
I don't know of any that suspend during pre-alternate, but I would be, yeah, not off the
Okay,
top.
there's lots in pre-basic, but I just didn't know in pre-alternate, so that's fine. And you know, there's all sorts of things we don't know, but I just wanted to think about it, but it's okay.
I don't know. I wouldn't be, I imagine it at the very least some terns probably do, but I don't know.
Okay. And another question here, did you come across any intersex individuals in your studies? I was just wondering if there were any differences between the pre-alternate molt in these cases.
I did catch a gynandromorph black-throated blue warbler in Jamaica in like 2008, but not in this work. I think that's a cool question. And, you know, I didn't get too much. We looked into sexual dichromatism, you know, whether just birds that where the males and females look more different are more likely to evolve pre-alternate molts. And there, you know, there may be a little bit of something there. We didn't find that it was a strong driver. And I think, you know, looking potentially at intersex individuals could shed some light into especially mechanisms of dichromatism and molt. But no, not in this case, not since that one very cool black-throated blue warbler that was like right down the middle, male one side, female the other side. Unfortunately, it was a first cycle bird, so it was like, you know, formative plumage male, formative plumage female. It would have been cool, sick, but you got to take what you can get, I guess.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. It's a pretty cool
it was
bird.
pretty cool.
All right, I don't have any other questions in the chat. But anyone else have any other questions they'd like to ask?
Well, thanks everybody. I really appreciate it.
All right. Well, then we'll sign off for now, and I'm glad you could all come and join us this evening, and have a great weekend.